Hello and welcome to this webinar to help you get your thought leadership right in 2020. Just to introduce myself, my name is Tim Prizeman. I'm a director with public relations agency with Reputation Builders Kelso Consulting. For people who don't know me on this webinar, I have been involved in advising business-to-business technology, financial, professional and consultancy firms for well over 20 years on building powerful reputations, and indeed been advising them and helping them on thought leadership programs since before the term was being used. I've written a book on it, the Thought Leadership Manual. It's available from all good bookshops and Amazon, and a lot of the things we'll be talking about are explained in much more detail on that. So if you want to go into areas more detail afterwards, please do give me a call, but you will also be able to get all my thoughts in that book. In terms of what we'll be going through, this webinar will last under an hour. As you're listening to the recorded version, if you have any questions, please do ping me an email. There is my email address, timp@kelsopr.com, and I'd be delighted to either respond or speak with you. What we'll be covering is really the sorts of things you need to know to make your thought leadership program a success in 2020, ranging from getting the program started to, at the end, getting the PR right. And also we'll be quickly covering some of the sorts of things we regularly come across that have caused people's thought leadership campaigns to misfire, so that you know about them in advance and avoid them. For people on the webinar who don't know Kelso Consulting, there's many people signed up who do, and a big welcome to you, but also a big welcome to people who don't know us. We're a award-winning firm of reputation builders. We do everything that you would expect a PR agency to do, including getting national media coverage for our clients, helping create and get the most from case studies, and also things that maybe some PR agencies don't get involved in, whether it's helping people arrange speaking at events, ghostwriting articles and blogs, helping with your online digital reputation, particularly on LinkedIn, helping you write the sorts of entries for awards and analysts that will really help you stand out and have the maximum impact, and of course all aspects of creating and delivering high impact thought leadership programs. Now, the first thing on a webinar about getting your thought leadership right in 2020 is to just spend a moment on what your thought leadership is. And this may sound an academic question, but it's not, because the biggest problem I think with most people's thought leadership is that they define things as thought leadership that aren't. There's just ordinary marketing or PR, and then they wonder why their thought leadership is falling flat, and the answer is because it isn't thought leadership. So typically the sorts of things that are thought leadership are things like insights from research. It could be thought-provoking articles, videos, white paper. Maybe you've got some insights from analysing your data, from spotting trends through being active in the market. Maybe it's because you've just got some sort of thought-provoking observations, although they clearly need to be backed by evidence for credibility. Just being provocative by itself, I wouldn't class as thought leadership. I'm not saying people shouldn't do that, but I wouldn't class it as thought leadership. Campaigning on important industry or policy events is a very powerful way of showing not just, well, both industry leadership and thought leadership. Not enough firms get involved in that sort of thing, but that very much campaigning is very much thought about as thought leadership. and it's actually demonstrating thought leadership. FOI, freedom of information requests, are a very good way of leading a debate, getting high impact. It's certainly law firms use that a lot, but it doesn't have to be law firms. Other people use it to strong effect as well. And indeed, organising landmark events could, for example, be thought leadership. You're getting all the people that matter in a room and helping move the discussion forward. That can be very much thought leadership, even if you aren't, if you're chairing rather than presenting. And there are other things as well that count as thought leadership, but it's, I think, important to equally recognise what thought leadership isn't. Thought leadership isn't just pumping out press releases and newsletter. It's not the sort of, low quality clickbait articles that get churned out for SEO. It's not something very technical that people aren't going to understand. It's definitely not your brochures. It's not, quite frankly, Me Too opinion. And a lot of people pump out data and research and then wonder why it doesn't get much coverage. Often it's because there's no insight in it, there's no interpretation, it's just numbers. So these are some of the examples of things that I regularly see defined as thought leadership, but clearly they're not. I'm not saying you shouldn't do these things, but these things are day-to-day marcoms and communications activity. They're not thought leadership by them in their own right. And clearly the quickest way I see for people to generate a thought leadership program is for them just to redefine all of this. Don't redefine it. But if you look around, thought leadership is actually all around us. Perhaps the granddaddy of it all is the McKinsey Quarterly, which is now in its 60th year or so. It's gone from a quarterly publication to an online in line with its with the times, but very much it was a platform that McKinsey, now the premier strategy consultancy, once a startup in New York, built its entire reputation and showcased itself on. Once upon a time in the CBI, some people thought, why don't we survey our members and we'll do a monthly business confidence index? The PMI is another example of this. It's been going so long, it is so credible, it is now a major influence on policy, and every time it comes out, it gets tons of coverage. It's hard to imagine the world without the CBI Business Confidence Index, as it is ultimately a thought leadership. The whole debate and the way it's evolved around global warming and climate change is a huge example, as is the recent example of Prince Harry talking about mental health. All of these are huge, are really very powerful instances of how public debate can be influenced, is influenced, and should be influenced through thought leadership in some form. Now, for your business, the first thing is, if you're looking to do thought leadership program, is why are you doing it? What is the business challenge that you are looking to overcome, that your thought leadership set? A lot of people on this webinar will be doing it to generate leads, and we'll look at that quite heavily as we go along, but it may not be the reason you're doing it. Either way, you need to think carefully about why your firm is doing it, but at the same time, if, for instance, your whole purpose is to generate leads, you must be very careful that what you're doing is thought leadership rather than a sales program. The two things can very much overlap, and indeed thought leadership is particularly powerful when they overlap, but ultimately if you're looking to generate short-term sales leads, you'll be pushed in one direction, whereas thought leadership, as we will cover, is very much around the big strategic message about your business. Clearly, with a big strategic message, you can then leverage that in different ways for short-term opportunities, and it becomes a hugely powerful asset. But generating 5 leads next month and building a powerful reputation so we are seen as leaders in this area are ultimately two different things, and you need to be thinking carefully which one really is your priority. So why do businesses do it? Well, first of all, in all the sorts of B2B areas we're involved and far beyond, if your marketing is going to work, you need to be saying something memorable, not memorable to you, and indeed not memorable just to people who are immediately in buying mode, but to memorable and going to grab the attention of people who are not in buying mode, or maybe they are at the tentative stages of it, but why are they going to remember what you are saying? So why are they going to engage with you? How are you going to stop them switching out off? And thought leadership is very much about delivering those important messages that they will engage with, rather than something very technical about something that's fine for someone who's in buying mode at the moment, but is not going to be of interest to people who are not. And as we know, very few people, particularly in the B2B area, are in buying mode, and you've got to get to them beforehand. Going back to 1993, a seminal book came out from David Maister, who many of the people on this will be familiar with. He's effectively the professional services management guru, and particularly for law firms. And his book, Managing the Professional Service Firm, which is largely about law firms, was seminal in its time, and it had a huge amount of useful and observations in it. And one of my favourite quotes is him reminding everyone that marketing works when it demonstrates, not when it asserts. He goes on to say, marketing tactics that illustrate someone's competence, speeches, seminars and articles, are infinitely more powerful than those that assert it. Brochures, direct mail and cold calls, for example. That was written nearly 30 years ago, and it's still as true today as it was then, only that it needs to add in things about the online world, as this was clearly pre-internet times. And indeed David Maister, who's retired now, but he still has a very active online following, well worth reading. So if your marketing is going to work, particularly at the higher level where you're trying to engage with decision makers before they've made their decision, you need to be in demonstration mode, not asserting mode. Indeed, it helps overcome, thought leadership helps you overcome the catch-22 of the senior sales cycle. The senior sales cycle is that senior people are rarely in buying mode. So it's hard, if you go to them with sales messages, the door is shut to you. And then they go into sales mode, they go into buying mode. They go into buying mode, but by this time, they've usually made their mind up who they want to use, or at least who the favoured candidate is. And so it's that favoured candidate's one to lose. And you'll have, particularly if you're from a challenger brand challenging an incumbent or someone like with a big brand like a Big Four firm, you will know this, that as soon as you walk in the door, you're already at a disadvantage. It's for them to lose, not for you to win. Thought leadership helps you overcome this senior sales catch-22 by engaging much earlier in the process, when people are very happy to deal with you. They're very happy to deal with people with interesting ideas and perspectives, as long as they're not being sold to. For instance, this research recently from Edelman, I think in conjunction with LinkedIn, into C-suite buyers, in this case in the US, found a very large number of them had put suppliers directly on tender lists because of thought leadership. It doesn't talk about people where it had indirectly influenced them, but this was directly as a result of it. They use it very much to vet organisations and understand their calibre, and it's it's very important to them. As an aside on that, besides generating leads and improving your ability to win leads at a senior level, we'll come on to public relations a bit later on, but ultimately if your business is smaller and a challenger brand, realistically for most businesses in that position you need to be talking about, you need to be undertaking some sort of thought leadership as an area where you can generate expertise, because smaller businesses just aren't of sufficient interest to the media to generate regular coverage based on their own news and developments. Maybe if you're a really hot and funky brand in a particularly sexy sector and you've got lots of high credibility backers and all of these sorts of things, you'll be able to do it. But the vast majority of scale up and startup businesses, really you need to be in the thought leadership space and the expert comment space, rather than simply expecting lots of announcements will generate coverage for you. By way of an example of how this particularly works, one of our clients was Global Expense. They went from 3 people to become the leader in their industry, which in their case was outsourced employee expenses. They went on to be the market leader. Very much the strategy right from the start was, if you want to be seen as the market leader, you need to act like it. We pointed out to them that they collected a large amount of data through people filling in their expenses claims online. We helped them analyse this data to create an annual benchmark report. Besides gaining 2 awards for it, it helped them get on things like the front page of the FT, large articles in the national media. Back in the day when the MP's expenses scandal came along, it had them ideally positioned as industry experts. They didn't know anything about parliamentary expenses, but they knew an awful lot about business expenses and were able to contrast what was going on in Parliament with what was their area of expertise, which was what was allowed in the real world. Ultimately, that sort of thought leadership allowed them to generate the sorts of insights that allowed them to stop selling on features of their technical solution and start challenger selling. So they were up against a much larger US competitor, which quite frankly had better technology, and yet they were regularly beating them for blue chip accounts on this. So in the end, the US competitor gave up and purchased it. So a good result for them, and indeed carried on doing this benchmark report as well. So it shows how thought leadership, as one example, can be used to by even startups and scale-ups to outpunch larger competitors. Details of that, a bit more details of that are on our website. So you're looking to get a program started. What are the sorts of things that you need to do? Well, the first thing is you need it aligned to the strategy of your business. What are the big things you're looking to achieve in your business? And the reason for that is that ultimately it's going to take time, it's going to take resources. Push comes to shove, it's not going to happen unless there is a big, strong business reason for it. Why should that get the priority? So first of all, the more you can align it to strategy, the better. Secondly, you need to have a senior level sponsor, so your time and resources don't get redeployed elsewhere. You need buy-in from your team, your boss, other stakeholders in the business, and you're going to get that buy-in through having alignment to strategy and a senior sponsor, rather than through, well, everyone else is doing it sort of approach, or it's whatever the reason you're putting forward, it needs to align to your strategy very strongly. Have realistic expectations. We sometimes get people who want their first program to knock Accenture or McKinsey off their perch. Great to have ambition, but the best reputations in business, most of them didn't do it on one initiative. It comes from repetition, regularity. We talked about the McKinsey Quarterly earlier. The reason McKinsey Quarterly is so successful is because it's got 60 years behind it. Do think about what is the ROI from it. It's no good, and think about this at the start. How will you measure it? What are you looking for? Is it leads? Is it engagement? Is it reputation? Is it change in policy? What is it you're looking to achieve? It's no good doing the campaign at the end thinking, was that a good investment? How are we going to measure it? Think of the sort of things you're going to want to achieve right at the start, how important they are, what the value of those to your business is. Start thinking about that earlier on. If you know what you want to achieve, then you can start thinking about how are you going to measure it, not getting into thinking how are we going to measure it when we don't really know what it is we're looking to achieve. And do think about the capabilities needed. We've got a slide a bit later on those, but you know, from the start, do you have these in-house? Do you have these within your usual team of suppliers? What are bits where you could do with extra help? Ultimately, these are big, complicated programs potentially, and there are benefits from bringing in people who know what they're doing. That's enough of an ad for me. What I think is a very important thing for you to do right from the start, though, is define what thought leadership is for your firm. Now, this may seem academic, but you're going to get pulled in all sorts of directions. As people get busier, different stakeholders start to impose their agenda on it. If you've got some sort of clear idea at the start what it is that people have agreed on, then when someone starts to put in messages about how the drop-down menu on the new version of your software is really great, you can look at your definition and say, that's not thought leadership. Or you might say, well, that is within our definition. Although if it is, I'd say your definition is wrong. But what you need to do is have that definition so you are clear what is your thought leadership and what is sales. You should be doing sales, you should be doing thought leadership, but you really need to be clear when you're in thought leadership mode and when you're in sales mode, rather than diluting all your thought leadership into a sales document and losing all its impact. So do write a definition for what is thought leadership for your firm that you can get buy-in from your colleagues. The definition I use for thought leadership in my book, which a lot of people have adopted in their businesses, is original ideas, important implications, backed by evidence, clearly expressed so people can understand it, not in jargon, publicly discussed, because ultimately it's not just thought, it is leadership, and if it's not out there in the public, you're not demonstrating it and you're certainly not giving leadership, and it ultimately needs to strongly influence the opinions of others, because this is what we're looking to achieve, whether that opinion is about your firm or about a topic. You want to influence the opinion of others so that influences their actions. Clifford Chance, one of the world's top law firms, has a thought leadership committee that gives strategic direction to its thought leadership, not day-to-day management of it. And they have a definition that is shared within the firm. They even put it out internally on calendars and things like that at times. And for them, thought leadership is views expressed by their firm that are forward-looking, contain intellectual content, progressive discussion on a particular issue, have a different angle on an existing theme or make new connections, and have a cross-border practice or sector element. So these are, for Clifford Chance, what they see as thought leadership. couple of interesting points about it. One of the world's largest law firms, and yet their definition of thought leadership doesn't contain law or legal or regulation or anything like that. Secondly, for them, very much that can be written material, but it could also, they like hosting events. So an event that progresses the discussion on a particular issue for them is very much thought leadership, and I would agree with them on that. So these are two examples. You may want to adopt my one, you may want to adopt Clifford Chance's, but I would suggest that what you really want to do is have a discussion with colleagues and have something that works for your firm and your particular objectives, rather than cut and pasting from someone else, and then it doesn't really fit very well. So your firm has decided that you've got some big business challenges that you need to tackle through thought leadership, or maybe you've got an existing thought leadership program that you want to work better. Getting the subject right is very, very important, and I'd say many firms do not spend enough time on getting the subject right, or they fall into the trap of thinking it's of interest to us and it's going to really help with sales, so we should do it. So first of all, one of the problems we come across is people, they're clear on who their target is, but then they don't really think very much about them. So a lot of businesses want to use thought leadership to communicate at board and C-suite level. And we'll use the cybersecurity industry as a particular example about this. They want the board to be more knowledgeable and more engaged on cybersecurity, so they start telling them about software patches and day-to-day things like this. Now, thinking about what boards talk about. Boards are interested in things like policies, strategy, resources, perhaps at a high level, regulatory compliance, all of these sorts of big strategic issues. So there's no point dealing with the board or hoping to engage with the board if you are dealing on very much day-to-day execution and operational and tactical issues. Similarly, if your target is much more at the middle management level, then talking to them about big issues that are several levels above their pay grade being dealt with by the board, they may be interested, but it's not what they're really engaged with. So the first thing is, get your thought leadership not at the level that's of interest to you and that you want to try and educate the board on why your particular product is the most amazing in the world, but think about what are boards about, and engage with them at that level, not seeking to educate the board about your particular area. Everyone who has tried this has failed, and the cybersecurity industry is an obvious example of it. Secondly, anyone on the webinar, and there's very many, who are familiar with marketing will know about the buyer's journey. And businesses, so this effectively starts with a latent opportunity of need, some sort of awareness, they seek solutions, they research them, they justify them through a procurement process or whatever, they make the buying decision. Now, research from HubSpot, which I think sounds pretty much common sense, is that nowadays a very large amount of the decision is made before people speak to a salesperson. That salesperson might be a professional salesperson, it might be the partner in a professional services firm, it might be the owner of a smaller business or a consultant at that level, but ultimately whoever's wearing the salesperson's hat Once upon a time, there weren't many sources of information. You had to speak to salespeople. Nowadays, there's a huge amount of information on the internet, and so you can do a lot of research, not just into the solution and alternative solutions, but particular buyers online. So most of the decision making is being done before they engage with you. But most firms' marketing is aimed at the people who have effectively already entered. They've not just entered buying mode, but they're well in it. So it's things like service details, company details, credentials, testimonials, brochures, all of these sorts of things are fine, and they're really important for people who are in that final stage. But how do you engage with people at the earlier stage? And clearly that's where thought leadership is particularly important. So what you need to be doing is thinking about what are the sorts of issues that are going to engage with people at this earlier stage. Yes, it can be very helpful when you are going at later stages, as we saw from the research earlier. People use thought leadership at a later stage to assess your quality and credibility and your thinking. But at an earlier stage, there's no good trying to engage with someone who's got a latent need on why your particular service quality or software or whatever is amazing. They're just not interested. So thought leadership needs to be working on those sorts of areas rather than applying to a very narrow number of people who are already engaged in buying mode, because as we discussed earlier, they've already decided who is their favoured solution. So this diagram I created is very much about helping you decide where you should be going. So there's 3 overlapping areas. So I would suggest the first one you need to think about is very much the key challenges for your target business sector. So say you are targeting financial businesses in the financial services sector, and it's very important for thought leadership in your marketing. Good quality marketing is not about nice brochures and logos and things, as important as those are. Successful marketing is all about segmentation and focusing on particular targets where you can be strong, rather than going for a large number of targets where you will be bland. So for thinking about your target sectors, what are the key challenges for that business sector? So that's number 1 in this Venn diagram. The second one over on the left is what are the key challenges for your decision maker? The more you can get involved in the, shall we say, the day-to-day personal challenges for these people. And so, for instance, a lot of, if you're targeting a service department within a business, so something like HR, technology, maybe IT, maybe I don't know, maybe marketing, for instance. Typically these sorts of departments are angst ridden about how to become more strategically important for the business. So that might be one of your area to focus on, is how to help make these people more strategically important. You're dealing with the areas that are particularly strategically important to that whole sector. And then the third area, because there's no point engaging with them on things that really have absolutely nothing to do with your business, because you'll have a nice conversation and they'll look at your services and then say, thank you very much, but you can't help us, we'll go to someone who can. You need these areas to have some sort of overlap with the way you help businesses. So if you were to look at this diagram, the best place I would suggest, through a creative process which you may facilitate yourself, or you may bring in someone like myself to help you facilitate, is an area where there's big strategic challenges for your target businesses. It is a good chance for your target decision maker to shine, or maybe there is a pitfall for them, but either way it must be something where they're thinking, blooming hell, there's risk or opportunity for myself here, and it must overlap in some way with the services of your business. That's not so your thought leadership shouts about your services and businesses. In fact, that will kill your thought leadership, but it just ensures that as your program goes through, there ultimately it leads to discussions about how you can help, and indeed, because you're involved in the market, you will be knowledgeable about this, and so you'll be doing thought leadership on an area you are knowledgeable, as opposed to trying to do thought leadership on an area where you're not knowledgeable. And clearly that is a good way to make sure your thought leadership is bland and not very thoughtful, because clearly you have no knowledge or little knowledge on the subject. Although I'll flag that up as an area where I often find businesses going wrong. They want to break into an area, they do thought leadership on something they don't really know very much about, then they start to row back when they realise they're not really sure, and their thought leadership actually isn't even me too, it's one stage down from that. Okay, so getting the maximum commercial impact, you've decided to do thought leadership, you might be doing you might be doing an event on it, you might be doing a white paper on it, you might be doing research on it. Better still, you're doing a whole program that builds rather than just trying to do one huge initiative from the get-go. And as we talked about earlier with people like McKinsey, and indeed you can draw from Accenture and people like this who've been doing thought leadership a very long while, their initiatives build and build rather than suddenly appearing out of nowhere. If you're going to do a big thought leadership initiative, it's much more likely to succeed if you've done some small and medium-sized ones beforehand. So and the key thing I would say on top of that is, when you're doing thought leadership, from the earliest stages, have a clear plan on how you are going to use it. Often I come across businesses who say, we'll decide how we're going to use it once we know what our thought leadership says. I can honestly say that this is going to destine your thought leadership program to failure, for reasons I'm very happy to explain if you give me a call. But if you don't have a plan for what you're going to do at the end of it, from early stages, all it will do is sit in a cupboard. And that plan, it should last not for a week, not for 2 weeks. You've put a lot of effort into it. You need to be thinking how you would use this asset or series of assets over a 6-month period, a 9-month period, a year's period, rather than thinking we'll have one seminar, one tweet and a press release. If that is your launch program, give me a call, because you're headed to disaster. So think about, right from the earliest stage, the more you prepare early about how you're going to squeeze all the possible value from it, the more success you will get from it. But how do you get the very most from your thought leadership program? It is ultimately about repetition. Repetition, repetition, repetition. The best thought leadership programs are those that have been allowed to repeat and repeat, so they become industry events. The people who get the most impact from their thought leadership do regular thought leadership activity, so they get better and better at it. What I often find with businesses is they do one thought leadership program, think, oh, that was hard work, we won't do that again, and then they try again 2 or 3 years later on a different theme. Of course, all this is doing is ensuring that, first of all, the first bit of effort was wasted, because you having built up that experience and that initial foundation, you're not building on it, and all you do is then move over and create foundations in another space, which of course is the hard work, but then don't harvest from that subsequently. So right from the start with your thought leadership activity, think, how are we going to repeat this? Is this going to be the same initiative we do every year? If so, don't just judge it on the first one, because clearly you're learning on the job. Think about it over a 3-year cycle, or if it's going to be quarterly, over a year's cycle. Don't expect the first one to be a stunning success. It would be fabulous if it is, and it can be a fabulous success, but is that the realistic way to judge it from? Very much reject from the start having very vague objectives for your thought leadership. Otherwise, if you have vague objectives, you'll never know whether it was successful or not. In fact, you probably won't even achieve them because you're not really sure what you're aiming for. And a typical vague objective is, well, a lot of firms sometimes, or I hear a lot from firms, which is get the name out there. Well, there's nothing wrong with getting your name out there, but let's be a bit more specific. What does get the name out there mean? Does actually getting your name out there really help when there's lots of other competitors and people are looking perhaps for a deeper understanding of your expertise in this particular sector? All of these sorts of things. So be specific from the start what you're trying to achieve. Be clear on the value to your firm. Be clear on how you will measure the change from where you're starting at, and be clear on how you will identify and record the value the initiative brings to your firm. And these aren't necessarily easy things to do because there isn't a thought leadership barometer that you can quickly download and that will give you all the answers. Each firm has different systems and processes, but it's one of those things. If you spend 5 minutes on it and think it's too hard and give up, then you won't have very many measurements at the end of it. But if you think a bit more carefully about how these things will do and whatever, then actually you can start to come up with good examples of how thought leadership is helping your business. To give a very granular example, with one of my clients, they're a law firm. They started attaching a thought leadership report to letters of appointment as a final stage to clients. Their letters of appointment had a 90% sign rate before attaching the thought leadership report, as this will be of interest to you, got their sign up rate to 95%. So 5% increase when you're talking about the value of a fairly large legal project is a very considerable amount of time for a considerable amount of income from simply attaching a document. Now, that wouldn't have been, without discussing these sorts of things and trying things, we wouldn't know that was a way to measure the value. In fact, we were probably at the start wouldn't have even thought that maybe the thought leadership document would have that impact, but it was worth a try. They measured it and it had that effect. So it's something that your business needs to be thinking about, but you may not come up with the great answers right at the start. But if you keep coming back to it, then, as in that example, you can find other ways. And indeed, they had a number of these sort of litmus tests around the business that was identifying that the thought leadership was having a really beneficial commercial impact. A big fear for many people with their thought leadership programs is that it's going to be weak or even wrong. Now, these I would say are unrealistic fears, but they can happen, or at least your thought leadership being weak, it's pretty rare and pretty unlikely that you're going to put out a document which has a prediction that's so binary that you will be right or wrong on it on a major trend. But how do you prevent weak thought leadership? And indeed, the world is awash with Me Too comments on it. Well, the first thing to do is invest the time up front getting it right. Dare I say, there are some firms, particularly in the professional services area, where people are more interested in having they'll dedicate lots of time to an inquest about why it went wrong, rather than getting involved at the start to make sure it goes right. Again, I often find firms where trying to get people in the room for a brainstorm meeting, they won't do, but they're very happy to read long documents, to proofread them at the design stage and talk about the pretty graphics. Pretty graphics and getting the proofreading right are absolutely fundamental, but I would suggest that is not where your thought leadership is going to stand out. Put the thought in at the start and not at the end. Well, both at the end, but particularly at the start. Make sure your thought leadership has some clear strategic viewpoint. We'll come on to that a bit later on, but ultimately you need to be having some sort of strategic viewpoint. Maybe not right from the very start, but it needs to come through fairly early. If you look at people who are really successful at thought leadership, and this is not just commercial firms, but particularly also you can look at academia and science and these sorts of areas, the thing that really helps is a tough peer review. Now, in your case, peer could be, and definitely should be, people within your organisation, but it can be other people you can trust. And quite frankly, I would suggest that you should involve some trusted clients within this very powerful way to engage with clients, to say you're doing some thought leadership in this area. Would they like to be involved, and can you bounce some ideas off them? Now, some people are terrified of this. They think it shows them as lacking knowledge to their clients. Quite the opposite. Now, if I was an accountant and I went to a client and I said, I'm really not sure about all this tax stuff, can you help with me? Then clearly that's going to undermine your professional standing in the light, in the eyes of the client, because that's the sort of stuff you know about. On the other hand, if you went to a client and said, there's some new tax changes coming through, we think they're going to affect your sector, we're having a look into this and wondered if you would like to be involved, I would suggest that client is going to react hugely favourably to this and think, thank goodness they are looking at this area, I'd love to be involved. So, first of all, your initial hypothesis: peer review from colleagues, peer review from other people you can trust. Next stage, your findings and conclusions. I would actually suggest on this you have some sort of scoring on it, perhaps 1 to 5, with 1 being really weak and 5 being amazing. And if people aren't scoring 4s and 5s on it, it's a question of going back and trying harder on it. The advantage of having a scoring mechanism is really it stops people giving you, oh, that was quite interesting type feedback. Give them a number of parameters they can score you on, and if the scoring isn't 4s and 5s, then you need to go back and work on it hard, because if quite frankly, that will ensure your thought leadership is really good, as opposed to thought followership, which is just saying the same things as everyone else. And the other critical thing is that people do it all at the last minute, or they say we've got to launch by this date. They don't build in sufficient time for reworking it. If it's not up to par with your timetable, make sure you have the time for reworking in it. Okay, so in terms of getting the PR right, the critical thing is to have a big strategic message. Now, often people get that completely mixed up with the opposite end, which is their credentials. Wow, we've got great clients, we've got fabulous sales documents, we've got awards, we've got perhaps a tech company, we've got amazing analyst comments. These are all really good things to have, but they're a bit like a Greek temple. These are the foundations. No one is interested in looking at the foundations of a Greek temple. We want to see the beautiful top to it. So first of all, it's really important you have awards, sales documents, happy clients, but these are your foundations. If you were to look at perhaps some of the pillars that generate coverage, and in this case I use a tech scale up as the examples, but you'll be able to interpret them for your sector. So tech scale up sorts of things that get coverage are pillar number one: new funding, big brands backing you or investing in you, prominent people from big known businesses being hired by you. So sort of, you know, there's a bit of a buzz and credibility about you. So that's number one. Very much named clients signing you up, so and so is using your software, press release, case studies of how businesses have made big gains through using your software or whatever approach it is. So that is very much the sort of thing the media are interested in. Do you illustrate a hot trend? AI it probably peaks on the hype cycle, but AI, are you using AI? If you use AI, journalists want to know a bit more about that because they're writing about it. And then research, analysis, comment, very much the thought leadership pillar. What sort of interesting findings do you have into the major challenges of a particular sector, business, particular type of business, perhaps employees in a particular challenges they face? And then on top of these goes your big strategic thought leadership message, which is we want to be known about this or whatever. It's important this isn't a strategic message about how wonderful your software is and its great features and things like this. It's a strategic message where someone thinks, oh, I'm writing about X, or X is a problem for me. These people are experts in X. I will go to them. And the more narrowly you define that around your business, quite frankly, the more problems you're going to end up having with your thought leadership, because it becomes more and more salesy and tainted, which is great for sales situations, but it's not great for you being seen as an expert and authority on a broader topic. So getting the PR right is something many people on this webinar will be particularly interested in. Now, the first thing I would say, though, is a lot of firms, and you may find this surprising coming from a PR agency, a lot of firms put far too much stress into the press coverage driving the success of their thought leadership report. Now, ultimately, journalists are unreliable and flaky individuals, and if your success, your campaign's success depends on them, I would suggest that this is setting you up for a fail already. So I would always suggest with a thought leadership campaign, you have a lot of activity involved with it that you control, and you see the PR as an extra icing on the cake. Don't make the mistake of having the PR as your cake. Have cake and icing. So in terms of the icing that PR brings, because clearly it can supercharge the impact of your credibility and whatever, you need to be thinking about the media very much wants clear so what in terms of winners and losers. You've got to think about the timing. If, for instance, if you want to talk about big issues affecting banks, you want to do it around bank results time. You don't want, there's no point doing it a week after bank results time, because everyone's written about bank results and has moved on. And when I say bank results, they're talking about all the big challenges affecting banks. So you might want to do it a couple of weeks before, as an example, when people are writing about these things, rather when they feel they've done banks to death. Think very much about a campaign rather than a one-off splurge. I've talked about the importance of regularity and reputation. Look the part if you're going to be an expert. It is amazing how many people want to be seen as an expert, and then you go to their website page and there's like about 3 lines of information about them and nothing on the topic that their campaign is on. You go to their LinkedIn page and it's a selfie taken from their iPhone while they're in the garden or whatever. So if you want to look like to be seen as an expert, look the part. Remember, it's about insights. It's not about data. It's about insights. So if you're doing research, it's how you interpret. What does the data say, not just providing lots of number. And the key thing as well with the media is you need to treat the media like a client. Too many people, and don't fall into this trap, somehow think the media should be dealt with on a transactional basis. They're there for when you want them, you send them a release, they busy themselves writing it up, and that's the way it works. With one-off transaction, with you giving them something, they giving you something hugely valuable, and that's the end of it. That is not the way the media works. Indeed, it's called public relations for a reason. You need to think that, like the media is a client, they need to be a priority. How will you give and take with them? How will you build a relationship to them? Clearly, these are the sorts of things a PR advisor, at least a good PR advisor, will help you with. But you need to be, what does the media want from you? It might be information, it might be availability, it might be particular details. But if it's all one-sided, I want this in the media, give it to them, I'm not available, then clearly you are going to struggle, as that is not how the media sees their relationship with you. So I've listed here most of the skills you will need within your team to do thought leadership, not just in terms of creating it, but also the subsequent launch for it. Now, many of these you already have because they're involved with your marketing and things like this. I think it's very particularly important, though, you think about project management and program leadership. Not enough thought goes into these, and it just gets dumped on someone, and then it drifts for several months because no one makes time available, and you have a committee meeting after committee meeting. And these sorts of things, you need to think, how are we going to drive it forward? Who will have the skills, not just the management role for saying, let's get on with it, but how do we organise it? You may well have someone in-house who's very good at this. You may well need someone brought in specifically for it. Same for the creative bit. Dare I say, 5 accountants around a table, 5 lawyers around a table, some really expert opinions on it, but you're probably going to struggle to have creative ideas. Certainly that's my experience, without some sort of facilitator there. Who will be the facilitator that draws out creative ideas, interest in the new ideas, new perspectives? If you are able to do that within your team, that will be great. But without that, there is a danger you simply decide to do the same stuff as all your competitors because you all have a very similar perspective. So, avoiding thought leadership fails. Well, number one is that it all gets dumped on the marketing manager. They've got all their other jobs to do, and it's, quite frankly, involves a lot more work than you think it does. And of course, they aren't, either whether it's through the skills or more likely through the time, bit of both, can't give it the drive that it needs. I've mentioned about you only decide what to do with the research once you've done it. I've mentioned about having a program that launches that isn't only makes limited use of it and doesn't last a few months. Maybe it lasts a few weeks, maybe it lasts a few days. I'm amazed that some big firms, indeed other firms, they spend tens of thousands of pounds on research and they do 2 tweets about it. Think a bit more about how you can do it. If you're spending £10,000 on it, I would suggest you want hundreds of tweets. If you don't know how to do that, give me a call. When you've done your thought leadership, check it back on this chart I was doing. Where does it fall? If it doesn't fall in one of these central areas, it really suggests to me that you're going to have problems, and it's better that you get on track now at an earlier stage rather than leave it, put out all the launch, it falls flat, and then you have to retrench. Although if you are in that situation, we do have a thought leadership fails service where we breathe life into projects that haven't gone according to plan. But it's better if you don't get into that situation in the first place. And I've mentioned about having thought leadership that's all about PR rather than all the other channels under your control around social media, around events, around direct mailings and emailings to clients, about all these other things. Okay, so questions. Email me through any questions that you have. timp@kelseypr.com, as I mentioned earlier, or do give me a call. Our details will be at the end. Thank you very much for joining me. Kelso Consulting can help your business create great thought leadership, whether it's through particular interventions. As I mentioned, we have our Thought Leadership Rescue one. We have a Maximise in Sales workshop where we help people ensure their thought leadership gets the very maximum commercial impact. We can help at the earlier stages, helping you provide breakthrough insights, or indeed just helping specify the program, getting the best possible launch pad early on. Or we can do a start to finish initiative where we work with you to manage the whole program. I hope you've enjoyed this webinar and found it useful and thought-provoking. We have other recorded webinars available on our website on making Google Ads work for your consultancy or professional businesses. For smaller businesses, we've got thought leadership on a budget, or indeed we've got plenty. These things work for big businesses, departments in big businesses with a small budget as well. And if you're a B2B business, getting press coverage for you in the national media. Thank you very much for joining us. My name is Tim Prizeman. I'm from Kelso Consulting. We're an award-winning public relations agency. We help build powerful reputation. Do join us for our other webinars, whether live ones or the recorded ones I mentioned. I hope you have a good day and wishing you every success for your thought leadership initiative.